Henry Newman, one has to admit it is a little bit confusing. You've got Theresa May saying we're driving from the front, which is kind of an obvious one, to be honest. You've got Boris Johnson being accused of being a backseat driver. I mean, I am personally feeling rather carsick.
Well, sorry for that. But I think overall, this shouldn't be too surprising that we're hearing Foreign Secretary making a Foreign Secretary speech. And this is all building up to the Prime Minister's speech this Friday in Florence. And that'll be the first major intervention from the Prime Minister on Brexit policy since the Article 50 letter and her Lancaster House speech, which is now 6 months ago. So I think inevitably there's a lot of speculation about what that will entail.
So you're buying this line from Boris Johnson today that it was just a drum roll for Theresa May's speech on Friday in Florence?
Clearly there are tensions inside the cabinet. And Boris Johnson, as we understand from newspaper reports, was planning to give a foreign policy speech. And that speech was kiboshed for whatever reason or delayed. And Boris Johnson decided to go on the record with this article. But I think that the real question is, what sort of country does Britain want to be after Brexit? And I don't think we should be refighting the referendum. I think the referendum gave us a very clear answer on the single market and the customs union. So I'm disappointed that Alison and others are trying to reopen those questions.
That's just not right. There was no clear indication given. The Leave campaigners were talking about staying in the single market. And actually, the referendum was a snapshot on just on one day. And now we all have a duty to act in the national interest and make sure that we protect people's jobs and their rights and make sure that we have the kind of high-value manufacturing that we do well in this country, as well as all of those service industries that people work in. We've got to protect those industries.
But there's confusion on both sides, and we'll get to Labour's confusion in a minute. But first with the Tories, I mean, this was, let's face it, this was not a drum roll for Theresa May. This was a drum roll for Boris Johnson, you know, and his potential ambitions to take over from Theresa May.
I don't have a window into Boris's soul to understand exactly his motivations behind this intervention. But I think what the whole government is saying is actually that we're going to be out of the single market and out of the customs union. I think clearly there's a question mark over what sort of transition we have at the end of the Article 50 process. But the question I want to hear from the government, from the Foreign Secretary and from the Prime Minister is where we're heading in the long term. Are we going to be just beyond a country like Switzerland or Norway, just outside the single market?
And we don't know that yet, despite the fact that the referendum took place more than a year ago.
Quite. Well, I think that's a fundamental question the country needs to decide.
And where we might agree is that we don't know where we're going, and that is extraordinarily problematic. Being outside the single market and outside the customs union has terrible consequences for my constituents.
But it's taken the Labour Party a year to decide whether you want to be in the single market and the customs union in a transition period. And we don't even know how long that transition should last.
It didn't take me a year.
It took your leadership a year.
But the fact is, Keir Starmer has moved our position towards remaining in the single market and the customs union. He said we should have that for the transitional period, which should be an extended period of time to protect employment in our country. I would like us to go further and say that actually that ought to be the destination, that we ought to, even as we leave the European Union, remain part of the European family of trading nations, because that protects the jobs and the rights of my constituents.
But what is the point of staying in the single market, staying in the customs union, paying into EU coffers, but not having any voting rights? Then you might as well say, what was the point of Brexit in the first place?
Well, it is possible to still have influence. But in the Brexit vote, even those of my constituents who voted for leave did not vote to fundamentally change the terms of trade. Lots of them voted because of that promise for the NHS on the side of a bus. Some of them voted leave to get rid of David Cameron. We can't assume that because Boris Johnson says that leave means leaving the single market and the customs union, he's right.
Well, this is disingenuous. It wasn't just Boris Johnson. It was David Cameron, it was George Osborne, it was the leaders of the Remain campaign and the leaders of the Leave campaign were all extraordinarily clear about that.
Why do we only...
That's not correct. Members of the Leave campaign said that we would stay in the single market, that we could stay in the single market.
Just one more. Isn't the problem here that the complexity, the ambiguity of this fundamental existential question is now inexorably tied up with the complexity of a leadership contest in the Tory party after this last disastrous election?
No, I don't think so. I think there is a very important question to answer about the single market. And that question is, if we're inside the single market, as Alison would like, we would have no say over the regulations and rules that are coming from Brussels. We'd have no ability to change our position on migration. We'd have no ability to regain the sovereignty for which people voted on the 23rd of June last year.
Any trade deal that you do involves ceding some of your sovereignty. That is how you make a deal. And to describe any other position is completely disingenuous. But if we really wanted to do this properly, wouldn't we do it on a cross-party basis rather than this show that we're seeing from the Tory party?
Well, I'm quite happy with the cross-party basis.
Alison McGovern, Henry Newman, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.